Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, our God and God of all generations, may our prayers reach your presence. And when we turn to you, do not be indifferent. Eternal One, we are arrogant and stubborn, claiming to be blameless and free of sin. In truth, we have stumbled and strayed. We have done wrong. I purposely read this prayer once again to stress how much all of this service is in the first person plural. There's a reason for that, and you'll find out shortly. So, if I have to ask you, what is this called, what would you tell? It's underneath my mustache. I know, this is my mustache, don't. But under the graying hair, no one knows what this little indentation is called? Who said it? It's absolutely called a philtrum. So, any film buffs here? Not one in this entire congregation. All right, Scott, I'm going to put you on the spot. Well, we'll try it, okay? So, you know Key Largo? The movie? All right, so Bogey plays an officer who goes to visit the father, who is played by Lionel Barrymore, okay? This is old stuff, I know, okay. And the widow, who is played by, of course, okay? The widow of a young soldier who had been killed in action under his command. The soldier's father asked him how he had died, and so the character played by Bogey, was it Frank McCourt, was that the name? Does that sound about right? I'm trying to do from memory, but okay. And so Frank McCourt, Bogey answered, 3 days and 3 nights he stayed awake directing our fire. Most of that time I was on the other end of the line. To keep himself awake, he talked into the phone. Talked and talked. Most of his talk was about the two of you. You'd be surprised how much I know about you both. And I'm sorry, I can't sound like Bogart. So, for instance, inside your wedding ring, there's an inscription. It says, evermore. That's right, responded the widow. And then he continued, and you, Mr. Temple, remember telling George what this hollow is above the upper lip? Before he was born, you said, he knew all the secrets of life and death. And that at his birth, an angel came and put his finger right here and sealed his lips. Now, so go home, check out Key Largo, the scene is there. How this Jewish story got into the movie is a mystery. So if it didn't come from Loren Bacall herself, which I would doubt, was it Walter Houston? Who was the... Someone help me here. I should have done a little more research. Okay. It may well have come from one of the screenwriters, him or herself. So Abraham Sacher tried to solve the mystery several years ago in an article in the Jewish Review of Books. But Sacher suggested the larger mystery was the original source of the story itself. If you simply replace the secrets of life and death with either all wisdom or Torah, which of course is taught to the fetus in utero and then completely forgotten the moment right before birth when the angel comes along and touches the baby's lips, and you have the story ascribed to Talmudic sources, which is a bit surprising since memory is at the very core of being Jewish. You've heard me say it before, to be Jewish is to remember is to believe. Remember the Hebrew lesson, so remember, the Hebrew word in this case is zachor, the root zayin chaf resh. And it is the subject of Yosef Yerushalmi's elegant and influential work entitled Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory. The root itself is mentioned in its various declensions at least 169 times in Tanakh, probably more than that. And then you have a Jewish tale that talks of memory being taken away from a child just as he or she is about to be born. If memory is at the core of Judaism, why then does God have an angel come along and wipe it out or remove it or hide it in some way? So another story, this one told by Dara Horn about an incident which took place after she finished giving a talk about one of her books entitled All Other Nights. The title should be a little hint to what takes place. It is a story about Jews in the Civil War. So not surprisingly, several attendees came dressed appropriately in full Civil War regalia, including, of course, uniforms. After a talk, a few of them came up to Ms. Horn to introduce themselves in their Civil War personas. They're serious about this stuff, you know. So one goes up to her and says, "Nice to meet you, ma'am." I can't talk this one properly either. "My name is John M. Smith of the 8th Regiment of the New Cavalry." And while Ms. Horn might have momentarily wondered a bit how odd these Civil War enactors seemed, she quickly caught herself. Why? Because she knew that we Jews reenact living in Sukkot in the cold as if we were homeless. We either, depending if we're Sephardic or Ashkenazim, we hit people with scallions during the singing of Dayenu, or afflict our stomachs with matzah during Pesach. We pull all-nighters as we prepare to receive Torah on Shavuot, for we all stood at Sinai, even if the uniforms were nowhere near as cool. So perhaps the rabbis understood something about neurobiology in the brain centuries ago, long before we did. Wrote Joshua 4, "In Judaism, observance, shamor, and remembering, zachor, are interchangeable concepts, two words that are really one. For Jews, remembering is not merely a cognitive process, but one that is necessarily active. Other people remember by thinking. Jews remember by doing. Memory. So much of these days of awe are about memory. Rosh Hashanah is known as Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Remembrance. And this afternoon, many of us will share in our Yizkor service, in our memorial service. When I was younger, and I talked about this countless times with you, I saw Yizkor, the service, as the depths of our annual rehearsal for death. We began these Yamim Noraim, these days of awe, and I talked about this back on Rosh Hashanah, with words acknowledging their power, who shall live and who shall die. And this day, this haunting dress rehearsal for death, we virtually died last night and found ourselves standing before judgment. Our past presidents who were holding the Sifrei Torah, in a sense, represented the Beit Din. And of course, the open and empty Aron, the Aron for our ark, it's the same word that we use for a casket. The Torahs we put back in, but we know someday our bodies will be inside an Aron also. And we say Kaddish. Time and again we offer our confessions, which we're shortly going to do once more. Each al chet, we hit our heart. One time, right after we installed CPR here at the cemetery, at the synagogue, I compared it to a spiritual CPR. In fact, what do they teach you when they teach you CPR? You know what you do this to? What rhythm you do this to? Someone said it. Staying alive, staying alive. Ooh, ooh. The Bee Gees, what can I? But it's an interesting song to which, in a sense, you give yourself CPR, whether it's physical or spiritual. And then all of us yearn to hear that final Tekiah Gedolah, that final cry, as in some way we emerge reborn, inscribed and sealed in the book of life. Yet Yizkor may not simply be about death. Now, I quoted for earlier Several years ago, he tried to learn all about memory when he began an article for Slate on what could be called the Super Bowl of Savants, the USA Memory Championships. The article eventually became a book. Some of you may have read it, Moonwalking with Einstein, The Science and Art of Remembering Everything. Anybody read it? So I can get away with saying anything now then, right? You should. It's a fun book. Now, Four, average forgetful person that he was and still is, became a true mental athlete, and a year later won the United States Memory Championship. Yes, discovered Four, there are a number of mnemonic techniques and spatial concepts that can allow us to profoundly enlarge our memories. While we have never really seen a memory in the human brain, we do know that, to quote Four, at the most fundamental physiological level is a pattern of connections between some 100 billion neurons in that 3-pound mass atop our spines. Every sensation that we remember, every thought that we think, transforms our brains by altering the connections within that vast network. Now, if I have not lost you already, your brain will have physically changed by hearing those words. Noted neuroscientist Eric Kandel, long-term memories change gene expression, creating new synapses and embedding themselves into the brain. Remembering may actually change our brains. That is neuroplasticity. And remembering may even change the memory itself. Yizkor. What a really unusual service. Now, Yizkor is neither a noun, nor is it an adjective. So saying Yizkor is not the same as Yizkor service, memorial service. Yizkor, to quote another book, is a verb. So if it is a verb, what does it move? What does it change? What does it do? What do we remember? Well, perhaps for the first time during these Yamim Noraim, it moves us from our communal memory, as in the words I just shared with you before I started speaking, to each of our individual memories. No longer is the language in the first person plural, and this isn't one of the newer creative pieces that our movement has put into our machzors. This is in the traditional language itself. The language shifts to the first person singular. So take a look, since I would have spoken this afternoon, but there really isn't time, so that's why you're getting it this morning. Take a look inside your machzors. I want you to look first at pages 568. The service runs the part we're going to look at from 568 to 576. The easy one to find is a double-page blue spread. It looks like this. You really can't miss it. Okay, and you start looking down here. I know these aren't the traditional words, but look at them. It's all in the first person. I regret, I remember. Or it's in the first person possessive. My teacher, my friend, my wife. And then, if you open up to the next page, you come to the traditional prayers. So hold them there for a moment. Rabbi Shoshana Boyd Gelfand brilliantly points this out in her essay entitled Remembering Through Forgetting. Yizkor is an unshared experience. Shiva is communal, as the community surrounds the individual and creates as best it can, and as I try to do as your rabbi, a precious portrait of the deceased. Yizkor, on the other hand, sets up the one mourning for personal reflection in a communal space. Concludes Rabbi Gelfand by reciting Yizkor individually, without the corrective of others. we interact with our own memories, allowing the cells of our brain to mutate the memories as they are recalled. Our memories change as we remember. So even though we cannot have an actual relationship with the person we lost, we can have a dynamic relationship with our memory of them. Our memory literally keeps them alive in the sense that they continue to change and develop through our changing perception of them. In his book, Ford gives the example of one man he met, the story of a man he read about, studied by a Russian psychologist, Luria. Is that his name, Herzl? Does it ring a bell? The man only goes by his first initial S, who had tried to be a journalistic reporter because he had what we might say photographic memory, whether that really exists or not, but he couldn't forget anything. His memory was that good. The problem of never forgetting anything is that he couldn't do anything. So, now take a look at these traditional prayers which are here. This is the first of the three traditional prayers that go back as part of our Yizkor service, which really is only about 400 or 500 years old itself. Though one of the prayers goes back a little longer, and one of them was tied in with the Crusades, and another with pogrom. But it begins, if you look at the first four words, Yizkor Elokim et Nishmat, and it's left there open to add the name of the particular person that you may be mourning for. But what you are doing, you are asking that God remember the soul of your loved one. So what could it possibly mean that God remembers? Do memories come to God like they come to us, sometimes at the strangest of moments, sometimes in dreams, sometimes when all of a sudden an object or a person appears and sets something off inside of us? For that matter, to come back to S, the man I mentioned earlier, does God forget anything? Right? Unless, as Rabbi Margaret Mose-Wenig writes in an essay near the beginning of our Machzors on Yizkor, and I'll point this out to you in a minute, unless we are asking God to remember or take note of something that has not yet happened, namely a change in our relationship with the deceased, a change in ourselves that we are about to attempt to bring about. Now, the traditional words of this prayer, and they are in the Hebrew in the transliteration, but they are not in the English translation. The traditional words here have us pledging tzedakah on behalf of the one I'm asking God to remember. So the Hebrew has Hineni nodev tzedakah ba'ad hazkarat nishmato. The English, as you say, for the sake of tikkun olam, which has kind of become our catchphrase for everything about fixing the world, because perhaps the authors were still uncomfortable with the theology that the Hebrew presents. Perhaps the notion parallels another ancient notion that somehow by saying Kaddish, we help rescue the souls of the dead from the fires of Gehenna, or the closest concept we have of hell. One rabbinic authority even tells us that each Kaddish we say saves our dead from those fires for 90 minutes. It is as if remembering the dead helps them on their way to the world to come. By saying Kaddish on their behalf, or in this theological understanding, by giving tzedakah on their behalf, we help them get their just reward far more quickly. But Rabbi Wenig suggests something different. If you want to, you can take a look at her words at the beginning of our Machzors. It's in page 30 in the Roman numerals. You can read the whole thing, and you can just listen to me if you prefer. She interprets the Hebrew as follows. By pledging and doing this act of tzedakah, I hope little by little to externalize and thus internalize my lost one's love, and perhaps feel her presence more and more, and grieve her absence less and less. And she concludes, may God notice how the soul or the legacy of the deceased will change, if ever so slightly, through this act of tzedakah. And may God notice how my own soul, my inner life and my outer life will change, if ever so slightly, through this act of tzedakah. For with this pledge and this act of tzedakah, I open the files inscribed and stored in my brain and edit them before resaving them. In both the individual plea of Yizkor and in the giving of tzedakah, we remember, R-E-M-E-M-B-E-R, our living relationship with the one who no longer lives in our temporal world. So Yizkor, what else does it do? And this comes by way of Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove of New York's Park Avenue Synagogue, who spoke here back in March. I think this was in his Yizkor sermon of last year. He took it from Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, from the work of a psychology professor first at University of Virginia and then at Harvard, who I think died a few years ago, a Dr. Daniel Wegner. Dr. Wegner noted that much of what we remember is really stored outside of our brains these days in things like iPhones, or someone will correct me, in our congregation shared hard drive, or in the cloud, whatever that really is. What phone numbers can you still remember? Probably your childhood phone number growing up, right? If you're old like me, you know what your phone number was several years in your adulthood. But beyond that, you don't need to remember a phone number. We know either where to look or what button to push. But Wegner also argued that we store information with other people. So Wegner set up a memory test with 59 couples who had been dating for at least 3 months. He allowed half of them to stay together for the test of these couples, but then mixed and matched the other half of the couples, or it must have been 30 and 29. Given a memory test, the pairs who knew each other remembered substantially more items than those pairs who did not. When people know each other well, they create an implicit joint memory system, the transactive memory system, which is based on an understanding about who is best suited to remember what kinds of things. Transactive memory is a part of what intimacy means. There are hundreds of things for which we rely upon the memories of others. In Rabbi Cosgrove's words, think of the way couples finish each other's sentences, remember commitments, tell family stories. The measure of intimacy is based in no small part on the degree to which our memory actually lives within the other person. Whenever my wife lost her keys, which was several times a day, she knew who to ask. When a loved one dies, the shared hard drive crashes. In Dr. Wegner's words, it is a feeling akin to losing part of one's own mind. But Yizkor also reminds us that the converse is also true. For that memory bank still continues in the one who remains alive. Again now in Rabbi Cosgrove's words, we are not just keepers of a memory that a certain person lived, but for as long as we live, we are the actual sites, the locations in which aspects of our loved one continue. So Yizkor then becomes not the final act in our rehearsal for death. Rather, it becomes the first act in our rebirth into the book of life. Our brains change. Our relationships are remembered. And literally through us in our memory banks, our loved ones live on. Remember, our communal memory reminds us we were strangers, slaves in the land of Egypt. The Eternal One, our God, freed us from there with a mighty hand and led us through the wilderness of Sinai for 40 years until we reached the promised land of Israel. That teaches us what we have to do. The high point of the Exodus, when God in love gave us Torah on Sinai. As redemption came in the past, so too will it come in the future as we ever prepare for the coming of Mashiach. This is the story which defines us as a people. This is the story we remember by living it time and time again. Yizkor, our individual memories remind us, tells us that life begins anew this year. As our brains change, as our relationships are remembered, as our loved ones live on. Our memories are memories not only of sadness and fear, but of hope, not of fate, but of home. Concludes Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Judaism is humanity's faith in the future tense. The Jewish voice is the voice of an inextinguishable hope. Amen.